Good morning, students. Myself, Dr. G. Shepe, and I will be covering one important topic of hematology, which has been left, and that is immunity. So, this particular topic I'm going to cover in two sessions. The part one will be most of the natural immunity or innate immunity I'm trying to cover, and in the next session, I will be covering the acquired immunity part. If I'm getting time, I will be also covering the WBC and its functions. So today we are going to discuss this particular topic under these objectives. First, we will try to define immunity. Then, what are different types of immunity or classification of immunity with examples. And in detail, we are going to discuss regarding the innate immunity. And at the end, we are going to see the differences between the innate and adaptive immunity. So to begin with, the immunity is defined as the resistance exhibited by the cell or the host towards the injury caused by microorganisms and their products. So it is defined as the resistance. And how it is the resistance which will be exhibited by the host whenever there is an injury due to microorganisms and their products. So this is a defense mechanism, and always the immune system versus the foreign antigen, that is the microorganism and their products, which are acting as an antigen and they are foreign to the body. They will be the reaction will be continuously occurring inside our body, and this is the consequence of immune response. And by this particular way, the protection against infectious diseases is there. This protection can be specific, less specific, or more specific, depending on different factors which are there to activate this immune response. So, by definition, it is the resistance towards the injury, and it is continuously going on inside our body whenever there is a foreign antigen. And this immune response, which is activated, will be acting as a protection against the infectious disease, which may be less specific or more specific. Basically, there are two types of immunity. One is innate immunity or native immunity, which is also known as natural immunity. The second type is adaptive immunity or acquired immunity. So basically, the immunity is divided into two types. So this adaptive or acquired immunity again is classified into two types, natural and artificial. Both of these again are of two types, passive immunity and active immunity. So this is how it is classified. Now this classification is very much important, as in the exam, again, the definition and the classification of immunity is very commonly asked as an SAQ, as a Viva question, as a part of a long answer question, which is a very favorite question. So define immunity and give the classification of immunity is always a part of long answer question. So this native or innate immunity is, as we have seen, is of two types, non-specific and specific. And both of these can be of three types: disease immunity, racial immunity, and individual immunity. Whereas the artificial or adaptive immunity is basically of two types, active and passive, which can be again divided into natural and artificial type. So just a repetition of what we have seen. Now coming to details of the innate immunity, in this particular session we are going to discuss that. So what is innate immunity? It is the resistance to infection that an individual possesses by virtue of genetic and constitutional makeup. So it is present since birth, and the contributing factors are genetic and constitutional makeup. So whatever your genetic and constitutional makeup factors are there, which are present since birth, the resistance offered by these mechanisms is innate or natural. This is the first line of defense against all type of infection. It is not affected by the prior contact with infectious microorganisms or if you are immunized. So it is not affected by these two factors because it is completely dependent on genetic and constitutional makeup. It can be specific or it can be non-specific. it is specific, it will be resistance against the particular pathogen. If it is non-specific, then generalized resistance to infection will be offered. Now, what is species immunity? This is total or relative refractoriness to a pathogen shown by all members of that species. So it is particularly species specific. For example, resistance to plant pathogens and large number of animal pathogens. Nowadays, you must be seeing that there are so many disorders which are still we are working on that, finding the causative factors and whether it can be translated to animal to human or from human to animal. Like these, you might be having an idea regarding these 2 to 3 years, and there are so many pathogens which are specific to that particular species. So some of the diseases will be only occurring in the animals; they will not occur in the humans because they will be refractoriness to the pathogen, which is shown by all member of that species. The mechanism behind this particular resistance is still unclear, but maybe due to the physiological and biochemical differences between the tissue of different host species. So basically, it is thought to be due to these particular differences. And it is also dependent on whether or not a pathogen can multiply in them or not. If an infection has to occur, the pathogen should be able to enter in that particular organism, and then it should be able to multiply in them. So if you have different physiological and biochemical uh, factors and they are not suitable for this multiplication, then the infection will not occur. So this is type of species immunity. Now coming to the racial immunity. So within a species, different races may show differences in susceptibility to infection. As this is particular part of innate immunity, genetic innovation, by selection and by inbreeding, races are races can possess high degree of resistance or susceptibility to various pathogens. So basically, it is dependent on the genetic and constitutional makeup. So within a species also, different races may have different susceptibility to different type of infections, and it is due to the genetic factors by selection can give the resistance or susceptibility to various pathogens. For example, in USA, people of African origin are more susceptible than the Caucasians to tuberculosis. So this is races itself. So they are common in humans. So species that human species can have tuberculosis, but in the human species, a particular race that is African origin or these will be more susceptible than the Caucasians to tuberculosis. So that is one important factor you can remember. There's again one example is that there's a genetic resistance to Plasmodium falciparum malaria in some parts of Africa and Mediterranean coast. So it has been seen that these African and Mediterranean areas, they are resistant to these malarial parasite. So this is known as racial immunity. Then coming to the individual immunity, there may be species, there may be races, and then individual immunity also is counted. So difference in innate immunity is exhibited by different individuals in a particular race. Nowadays, it is again very famous that due to the coronavirus, individual immunity, yes, it counts. So if you are having loads and loads of immune boosters, vitamin C, good diet, good exercise, and it is just to build up our individual immunity. So genetic basis evident from studies on incidence of infectious disease in twins. So that can happen. For example, homozygous twins exhibit similar degree of resistance or susceptibility to nephromatous leprosy and tuberculosis. So to study this individual immunity, scientists have studied the incidence of infectious diseases in twins. And they have found that homozygous twins exhibit similar degrees of resistance or susceptibility to lepromatous leprosy and tuberculosis. But Otherwise, it is present only in homozygous twins. Otherwise, for particular individual, the immunity will be different in each and every individual. So even if the races are same, it will be individual immunity which is counting for the development of immune response. Now there are different factors which are affecting this innate immunity. The first and the most important factor is age. It is more risk is of less immunity is seen in cases of very young and very old people. So age is very important factor. The second important factor is hormonal influences. So in cases of endocrine disorders like diabetes mellitus or adrenal dysfunction, there is enhanced susceptibility to infections. You might be knowing that in diabetes mellitus, the carbohydrate metabolism is delayed. And if the carbohydrate metabolism is delayed, you get more amount of carbohydrates. And these carbohydrates are favorable for the multiplication of infecting organisms, and then you will be prone to have more infections. You must have seen or you must have heard that if you have any wound in cases of diabetes, it is difficult to heal. And the reason behind that is this, because the innate immunity also is affected. Then you might be knowing that the corticosteroids, which are given in so many disorders, they also suppress the immune reaction. So those patients, those persons, more commonly in cases of the graft, the kidney transplant, the transplanted organs, we have to give these corticosteroids. And then due to these corticosteroids, the immune response will be less, and then they will be more prone for the infections. So hormones, they are going to affect the immunity. Then comes the nutrition. And this is what we are doing now in these corona days. In cases of malnutrition, both the cell-mediated and the humoral, that is innate immunity and the acquired immunity, both are reduced. So if you want to improve the immunity response, immune response, you have to have the better nutrition. Now, what is the mechanism of innate immunity? So these are the three factors which are very, very, very much important, which is going to affect the immune process. Now, after knowing these factors and what exactly is innate immunity, how this innate immunity is acting. So the mechanism of innate immunity reaction or response is first by way of epithelial surfaces. So intact skin and intact mucosal membrane is acting as a mechanical barrier, and this barrier is the first line of defense. So whatever epithelial surfaces in your bodies are there, that mucosal along with the mucosal membrane, they will be acting as a mechanical barrier. They will not try to have these foreign particles, foreign antigen to enter inside your body. So thus it is acting as a primary line of defense. These will be having the bactericidal activity. Why? Because there is a high salt concentration in the drying state, then sebaceous secretions, and the long chain fatty acids and so. So whenever you will be having these drying sebaceous secretions, they will be having the high salt concentration, and due to that there is a bactericidal activity. So one more important factor you have to remember that some of the persons, they always have the habit of immersing their hands in soap water for longer period. And if you are having this habit, if any person is having this habit, then this bactericidal activity will be nullified, and due to that, frequent mycotic and pyogenic infections are seen. So you must remember that. Then the second important factor in the epithelial surface is mucosa of the nose. Itself, the architecture of the nose itself will try to avoid the entry of the inhaled particles. But also there is a mucus lining in the epithelium of the nose, and due to that, the foreign particles will be swept back to the pharynx. So they will be moved out of the cavity. Then the mouth, which is having saliva, the stomach, which is having the gastric digestive juices, they will be having low pH, and due to that, in secretions, as they are having low pH, there will be immune response or bactericidal activity. Then conjunctiva also, as it is always flushed with lacrimal secretion, the tears contains the lysozymes, which is an antibacterial agent, and this is present in all tissue fluids except in CSF. So this lysozyme will be again giving the foreign particles. That flushing action of the urine itself will be eliminating the bacteria from urethra. You might be knowing that whenever the urine secretion or urine output is decreased, then there are dangers of urinary tract infection. Why? Because the flushing action of the urine is decreased. So flushing action of urine always eliminates the bacteria from urethra. Then the spermine and the zinc, which is present in the sperm, again is having antibacterial activity. The acidity, which is present in the vagina due to the glycogen fermentation in the epithelial cells, and that fermentation is offered by acidic lactobacilli, makes it inhospitable for many infections. So this is how the vagina, adult vagina, will be prevented from having infections. Sperm is also having the protection, spermine and zinc is there. Then the vagina is also having the glycogen fermentation, which is present due to lactobacillus, and then it can prevent for many infections. The second mechanism for the innate immunity is that there are many antibacterial substances in the blood and the tissues which will be acting against the foreign particles. For example, the beta lysine, and this beta lysine is thermostable and it is active against anthrax and related bacilli. Then you have leucines and plaquins from the leukocytes and platelets, acidic substances like lactic acid in the tissues, lactoperoxidase in the milk, or interferons. And these all will be present inside the blood or the tissues, and they will be acting or contributing to the innate immunity. The third factor is cellular factor, and the cells which are involved for the innate immunity are phagocytes. There may be microphages or there may be macrophages. So depending on the size, they will be classified into microphages and macrophages. These can engulf many of the foreign particles. But if any of the foreign particle is having a covering which is known as opsonine, then it will be difficult to engulf by these phagocytes. So, for example, encapsulated Streptococcus pneumoniae are not phagocytized in the presence of opsonines. So, these things which we have to consider. Then the second line of defense has to work against these infections. Then Brucella, Salmonella, typhi, Lactobacilli, all these are different type of microorganisms. They resist the intracellular digestion and may actively multiply inside the phagocytic cells. So this is of course a part of innate immunity, the mechanism phagocytes. But remember that there are many microorganisms which can resist this cellular factor innate immunity. So these then we have to depend on the acquired type of immunity. Then we have the natural killer cells which are activated by interferons, but this is a non-specific defense against the viral infections and tumors. The next important mechanism by which the innate immunity is acting is inflammation, then fever. The next is acute phase proteins, that is, these proteins will be enhancing the host resistance. So they will prevent the tissue injury and promote the repair of inflammatory regions. And these are the proteins which are given CRP, alpha-1 acid, glycoprotein. These are different types of proteins which will be increased. And these acute phase proteins will be enhancing the host resistance. There is also a presence of toll-like receptor, which is known as cell-associated receptors, and these receptors are important for innate immunity. So for mechanism, how to add this innate immunity, you have all these factors. So the first and the most important is epithelial surface, which we have seen. So this is the first important factor, epithelial surface. The second important epithelial surface along with the mucosa. The second is antibacterial surfaces. The third is cellular factors. The fourth is inflammation, fever, acute phase proteins, and toll-like receptors. So by way of all these factors, the innate immunity will be activated. Now coming to the last part of this particular discussion, how they are differentiated. So innate immunity is always rapid, and it is always like by way of epithelial barriers, by way of macrophages, by way of fever, inflammation, activation of phagocytes, activation of macrophages, and it is very rapidly. But whereas the adaptive or acquired immunity takes time and it is having a slow response, what happens here is B type of lymphocytes, they will be forming the antibodies, and the T cells will be also activated, and there will be two types of immune responses which will be slow to develop. So this is how it is. Again, same figure it is shown here. So there is a entry of pathogen. So whenever there is a pathogen entry, the initial attack is by neutrophil, the natural killer cells, the macrophages, and the intact epithelium along with the mucous membrane. And these factors are known as innate immunity. Now, after having the initial attack, which is an innate immunity, there is an antigen presenting cell which is known as dendritic cell will be activated. This dendritic cell will be having the antigenic peptide, and this along with the peptide will enter into lymph node, and then it will be activated to form a T cell which is having the peptide, and this T cell can either be having a cell immunity, so there will be killer cells which are formed, or there may be B cell activation, which is antibody formation causing the humoral immunity. So this is how it takes time because it requires so many activation. So if B cell is activated, the second line of defense will be humoral immunity. If T cell is activated, then it is a cell immunity. Maybe both, but both of these are causing pathogen-specific attack. So by way of either B cell immunity, humoral immunity, or cell-mediated immunity, there will be antibody formation, and the antigen which is present by these pathogens, these will be destroyed. And this is how the defense mechanism through the immune mechanism is occurring. To summarize, this is how it is seen. Innate immunity, whenever there is pathogen, we have two types of immunity: innate immunity, acquired immunity. Innate immunity is recognition of traits shared by both broad ranges, and it is a rapid response. And this innate immunity, its first line is barrier defense by skin, mucous membrane, and secretion. The second is by internal defenses, phagocytic cells, antimicrobial proteins, inflammatory response, and natural killer cells. And then after this rapid responses, the acquired immunity, which is slow to develop, will be activated, and this can be of two types: humoral response, so that antibodies are formed against the infections, or there may be a cell-mediated response. Here, the cytotoxic lymphocyte is are formed against the particular infection. So this is how the immunity is working. Now, as a, I know that this immunity will be having again repeated in your second year in detail, but some of the factors which are again to add to more of your knowledge, I have added as a homework. So what you have to do is the first question is that what is the role of inflammation in immunity? I have given different mechanisms how this innate immunity is working, and one of the mechanism was inflammation. are not explained in that particular slide. So as a part of your homework, what you have to do is find out the role of inflammation in immunity. And the second question is what are toll-like receptors and helping, how they are helping in the immune response. So these are the two questions which are for you as an homework. Now, it is a question for homework for all 201 students, but what you have to do is prepare the answers on one PPT slide. So make one PPT slide and try to write out the answers. If you require two slides, you can use one for role of inflammation in the immunity, and second is for toll-like receptors and how they are helping in the immune response. So the answers you have to write on the PowerPoint slide. Add your audio explanation to it. So whatever you are writing as an answer, try to add the audio explanation to it and send this to my WhatsApp number, which is given. I will post that on the Google Classroom. Now, for posting two not one answers, it will be difficult for me. So what I'm going to do is randomly I'm going to select two roll numbers, and these two students is roll number 42 and roll number 173. So roll number 42 and roll number 173, I have chosen randomly. What they have to do is choose one of the two questions. So roll number 42, any of the question about the question, and roll number 173, any of the above question. Try to write the answers on one PowerPoint slide, add the audio explanation, and then send it to me on the WhatsApp. If you have any difficulty in writing or finding the answers, you can call and ask me. So that is all regarding this particular topic. In the next session, I'll be dealing with the acquired type of immunity. Thank you very much.